Hey creators! So recently we released this video where I showed you how to make quick and simple ragdoll animations with Unreal Engine. In the beginning of that video started with this really cool animation of this sci-fi soldier getting blown up. So I just thought I'd show you how I composited this shot in After Effects, because it didn't come straight out of Maya looking like this. And the key to this technique is the use of depth maps. They're an extremely powerful way of blending your effects with different parts of the background. Now really quick, if you want to follow along, and you have at least a free ProductionCrate account, we've provided a link in the description where you can download these files that I'm working with. So once you get those files, open them up, and I'll give you a quick tour of what's inside. So inside the zip folder, you'll find 4 things. You'll find the beauty pass, which is the actual render. And you'll find 3 other things called the midground plane, the foreground plane, and the background plane. And I'll show you what those are in just a minute here. But really quick, before we start, you want to click on every piece and make sure that it's at a frame rate of 24 frames per second. So you can see that the beauty pass, for example, came in at 30 frames per second, and that's just the default for After Effects. So here's how you can change that. Right click on it, go to Interpret Footage, Main, and just type in 24 frames per second right here. And let's drop these onto the timeline and see what they are. So let's grab the beauty pass and drop that on. And if you press play, you'll see the animation play. So as you can see, it's missing all the effects. There's no explosions or dust. There's not even a sky. If you click on this little checker box right here, you can see that the background is transparent, so we're gonna have to insert our own sky. Let's see what these other assets are really quick. So I'm gonna drag the background plane on top, and let's just turn down the opacity a little bit so we can see both images at the same time, and I'll explain what this is. So when I was originally working on the shot, I was having trouble tracking things into different parts of the image. And so in 3D, in Maya, I created these planes at different points in the scene, one for the background, one for the midground, and one for the foreground. And I put this really distinct pattern on it. And then I rendered each one out separately so that I could track it really easily when I get to After Effects. So this first one you can see is kind of latched onto the background where the sky and the explosion are going to go. And if I drop the midground one in there, and you can see that this one sticks to the ground in the middle of the road around the point where he gets blown into the air. And then the foreground plane tracks to about where the car is in space, so that if we want to add dust effects to the car, we have something to track to. Okay, but first we need some effects. So let's go up to ProductionCrate, and I'm going to search for Shockwave, and I'm going to use this Air Shockwave Burst number 2. It's actually a free effect. The next one I'm going to use is the Sand Shockwave Front 2, which is a pro effect, but I think if you search for free, there's a free version too. And then for the explosion, I'm going to use Desert Sandy Explosion 2, which is a pro effect. But if you're a free user, you can search for Ultimate Explosions, and there's a free version in there that you could use that looks pretty cool too. And while we're here, let's go to GraphicsCrate and find a sky that we can put in the background. There are tons of options. I went with this simpler one, which is called Sky Extension 2. I'm going to grab the 6K version, which is the pro version, but if, again, you're a free user, you can grab the lower res one, and it should be okay because there's no clouds in the sky in this one, so if you have to blow it up a little bit or stretch it, it won't be too noticeable, and we're going to actually blur it with camera lens blur anyway, so this should be fine if you grab the free resolution. So I'm just going to bring in all of my assets, and I'll put them in a little subfolder called pcrate, and we're ready to start compositing. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually track each of those background planes so that I have a point to attach each of these effects. So let's start with the background plane. So I'm going to slowly scrub through and just visually try to pick out a couple points that don't go off camera, because there is this really aggressive camera move. So if you were to grab some of these points here at the bottom, you can see they actually go off the screen. So just try to find some points that stay on screen the entire time. And we should be good if we pick some points from the middle of the canvas right here. So I'm going to switch to the tracker, and I'm going to go to Track Motion, and I want to track position, rotation, and scale because there's a 3D camera move here. And I'm going to pick 2 points roughly sort of near the middle of the composition like this. Okay, and let's track forward. Now depending on how fast your computer is, this may take a while, but I don't really recommend walking away because the track could mess up, so you kind of have to babysit it to make sure it doesn't lose track of what it's doing. So now let's right click over here and add a new null object to transfer that information to. So I've created this new null and I'm going to name it background track. Now over here in the tracking panel, I'm going to say edit target, and we're going to choose the background track, press OK, and then we're going to press apply. So now we've transferred those movement keyframes to the background track null. We can actually get rid of this background plane layer now, we don't need it. And if I press play, you can see this red square should stick to the background of the scene. And that's where we're going to attach the explosion and the sky. Let's do the same thing again for the midground. So I'm just scrubbing through it to try to find some points that stay on screen the entire time. I think I found them. It's this row right here. So let's motion track this. Once that's done, create a new null object. I'm going to rename that null object midground track. And then we need to edit the target, apply it to midground track, and hit apply. And once again, we can delete the actual midground plane layer. And just repeat that whole process again for the foreground. Okay, so now we've got our actual render, the beauty pass, and then 3 null objects, each of them tracked to a different part of the 3D scene: background, midground, and foreground. So the first effect I want to drop in is the sky, because it's just feeling a little bit empty without it. So let's drop that in, and I'm going to scale this into place like that. This one has a little row of clouds at the bottom. I don't want to see that, so I'm just going to try to avoid showing that part. And don't worry if this blue looks a little bit wrong. We're going to change that during the color correction phase. That looks a little bit weird that the sky doesn't move with the camera. So let's go over here to the right where it says parent and link, and let's choose the background track. So now the sky layer will follow the background. I'm just going to watch it to make sure that it doesn't ever show the borders of the image. If that happens, just rescale it and just adjust it. So this looks like it's the most extreme frame here, where his foot's up near this light. So that's where I want the top of the sky to touch the top of the canvas. Now I can see we're seeing the clouds, so that means I've probably just scaled it a little bit too small. Okay, pretty cool. So once again, I'm just watching through the whole thing to make sure I don't see any clouds that I don't want to see, and we never see the edge of the sky. Okay, next let's drop in the explosion. So again, I used the desert sand explosion, but if you have a free account, you may have used the ultimate explosion. Both of them should look good. And we're basically going to do just the same thing we did with the sky layer. I'm going to scrub down till where I want the explosion to go off. Now I don't want the explosion to start right at the very beginning like this. I want to have it go off at a certain point. And if you look closely, you'll see that at about frame 24, or 1 second in, an orange light appears on his helmet. That's where the explosion should appear, because this is light from the explosion. So I'll start my explosion around that frame. Now it's also a lot bigger than our canvas, so I'm going to scale this down, and I'm going to parent it to the background layer, and let's just slowly scrub through and see how this looks. Okay, at this point I can see the top of the explosion, so I just want to adjust that. We can also see the edge of the explosion here, so let's not do that. So just play with the scale and the framing, try to get it exactly where you want it to be. You'll notice that the explosion starts before he actually launches in the air, and that's because the shockwave from the explosion only travels at the speed of sound. So we should see the explosion and then he gets blown into the air by the shockwave. And I actually see an error. I see something wrong with it. If you play it back, you might notice that the shockwave seems to be kind of stuttering and glitching, and that's because it's actually playing at a different frame rate than our composition. So we actually need to delete our explosion out of the composition, and we need to interpret this as 24 frames per second. In fact, you want to do that for all of your effects. So the hotkey for that is Control-Alt-G, and you can just type in 24 frames per second. Or if you're not a hotkey person, you can right-click and go to Interpret Footage, Main, and change that to 24 frames per second. And now we can try to drop that explosion back in there. And let's press play to test it out. Much better. All right, so far so good. Let's just continue dropping in each of our elements. I want to add a little bit of force to this explosion, and that's where the air shockwave burst comes in. So this is just kind of an expanding bubble. It's kind of faint, and it's to show the pressure wave traveling through the air. So let's put that in the scene as well. And I think this pressure wave should actually travel maybe a little bit ahead of the actual explosion. I'm going to scale it down because it's kind of big. Maybe I'll try setting it to add to boost its visibility. And now we get this giant expanding shockwave that precedes the explosion. Maybe I'll even push it forward a little bit farther. Because if you think about it, the shockwave is traveling at the speed of sound, and the sand probably is not traveling quite at the speed of sound, right? So the next thing the shockwave is going to hit is the top of this hill. So we can actually add our little dust effect to the top of the hill to give it a little bit of a puff, so it looks like it's coming around the corner of the hill or up and over the top of the hill. And then later on we'll have it come down the road using our depth map and hit our actor. So next I'm going to grab the sand shockwave front 2, and let's put it on top of our beauty pass. And you can see right now it's in front of our actor, but don't worry, we will deal with that in just a minute here. Let's parent it to the background layer. And I'm gonna scrub it down so it starts later on the timeline. So we get the initial shockwave and then the explosion. And then I want this dust to appear on the top of the hill like that. So that's our timing. We can put this below the beauty pass so that it appears behind that hill. It's not quite the right color, but don't worry, we're gonna adjust all of that later on during the color correction phase. Okay, now for the really cool part. We're gonna do the shockwave that travels down the road towards our character and hits him and knocks him in the air. And for that, we can use the exact same effect, the sand shockwave front, but feel free to use any other effect from ProductionCrate if you think one would fit better. And this one's gonna end up covering the entire screen. So let's scale it really big, and let's also parent it to the mid-ground track so that it moves and stays attached to the road there where he gets launched into the air. So I actually want this to be even bigger, pretty huge. It's a big giant dust wave. So if I scrub through really slowly, I can see it just kind of appears in front of him, which is not right. We're gonna fix that in a second. And it stays attached to the road where we want it to, kind of right here near this guardrail. Now, when it goes off screen, I'm gonna fade it out because as he comes back down, you can see it's still kind of settling and I don't really wanna deal with that. So I'm gonna scrub through the timeline until it kind of disappears off screen, and I'll switch to opacity and I'll add a little opacity keyframe and we'll fade it out. Perfect. And I'm also gonna cut it short here so I can see that's where it ends. Okay, now we're finally gonna get to the depth map part, and that's what we're gonna use to integrate this into the scene so it feels a little bit more grounded and not just like a 2D effect on top of the video. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the beauty pass has something special in it, and that's a depth pass. And what the depth pass is a gradient from white to black, where the white pixels are the things that are closer to the camera, and as it gets farther and farther back from the camera, it fades to black around the point where the last crest of this hill is. And that's going to allow us to integrate things into this 2D finished render and make it feel like it's still 3D. So let's grab the beauty pass and drag it down and make another composition with it. And let's rename this composition depth. Okay, now remember that the sky is actually transparent, but we want it to be black. So let's right click and add a new solid, make it black, and drop it behind the beauty pass. So now when I turn on the checker, you can see the sky isn't transparent anymore. Now on the beauty pass, I'm going to apply a layer called EXtractoR. Drop that on. So when I rendered this out for you guys in Maya, I added an extra channel called a Z channel, and I can change each of these color channels here, red, green, and blue, to the Z channel, and we're going to get our depth pass. It doesn't quite look right yet, and that's because we want to scroll the black point back. See, I'm just increasing this, and you can see that the gradient is growing back towards the mountains in the background. We want to stop when we're just barely able to see the top of that crested hill right there. Okay, awesome. Let's go back to our main composition, and I'm going to drop the depth composition onto the timeline. And this is our new depth channel that we'll reference anytime we want to use it. We can use this for depth of field, like shallow focus. We can use it to integrate things into the background. We can use it to add fog, which we'll do in just a minute here. Now, really quick, if you're noticing that it doesn't look smooth, it's got stripes in it, then you want to click here to make your composition 32-bit. It'll just work better. Okay, let's hide the visibility of this depth pass. And now we're going to use it to integrate this little shockwave into the scene. Now, because the dust is moving, we actually need to pre-comp it, and we need to pre-comp it with a copy of the thing it's parented to, which is the mid-ground track. So I'm going to click on mid-ground track and duplicate it, and I'll just move that closer so we can see. Now we have mid-ground track 2. I'm going to switch the parent of the dust shockwave to mid-ground track 2. I'm going to grab both of those, and we're going to right-click and go pre-compose, and we're going to move all attributes to the new composition. We'll call this mid-ground shockwave. Okay, now we're ready to use the depth layer to integrate that mid-ground shockwave into the scene. So I'm going to just scrub to about right here where we can see the shockwave starting to form. And we're going to use an effect called gradient wipe on that composition. And we're going to change our gradient layer to the depth. What we can do next is just grab transition completion and turn it up. And we'll see the dust explosion sort of fading out. Now, it's backwards. We actually want it to grow towards the camera instead of disappear towards the camera. So I'm going to click invert gradient. And now you can see as I adjust the transition completion back and forth, it looks like it's wiping towards the camera behind the actor, which is really cool. We also have the transition softness. Now this is really sensitive. I would set it to between 5 and 10%. I'm going to scrub to right when we see the background dust appear at the top of the hill. And I'm going to set the transition completion keyframe at about 90% in this case. Choose whatever setting looks best for you. And then right here, when he lifts off the ground, I'm going to set my transition completion to 0, and that will cause it to wipe towards the camera like this. So we can adjust the timing of this. I feel like it's not quite happening quick enough. So feel free to adjust the keyframes as needed. So my next thing I want to do is put a little dust poof around the car when he lands on it, just to increase the weight of his impact. And again, we're going to use that same dust element, but feel free to mix it up and use other elements from the store if you want to. So let's drag and drop this on top of our beauty pass. This one is going to be tracked to the foreground track. So let's go parent, foreground track, and I'll just get it positioned in place. I want it to appear when he slams down on the car like this, and we can blow it up, position it around the car. And once again, it looks really fake when it's just a 2D layer on top of everything like this. So let's use the depth pass to integrate it around the car. To do that, I need another copy of the foreground track. So let's duplicate that. I'm going to move it down towards the dust element just to keep them together. I'm going to change the parent of the dust element to foreground track 2, which is the one I just created. And then we'll select both of them and right click and go pre-compose, move all attributes to the new comp. And I'm just going to play it to test to make sure it still follows the camera as expected. All right, let's grab gradient wipe and drop it on there. And I'm going to find a good test frame like right about here where he's behind the dust element. And let's change the gradient layer to the depth pass again, increase the transition completion, and I can see it's wiping the opposite direction that I want. It's deleting it from the back and leaving it in the front. I wanted to do the opposite thing. So let's go invert the gradient. And you can see now as I turn it up, it disappears from in front of the car and goes behind the car. And I'm actually going to slowly increase it until it looks like it's clipping the car. So it looks like it's kind of coming out of the wheel well and underneath the bumper. That's a little bit sharp, so let's increase the softness of it to about 5, maybe 7%. You may need to adjust the transition completion again. And let's see what that looks like. So really cool. It looks like it was rendered with the 3D footage. It looks like it's integrated really well into the scene now. Awesome. Now that's actually all the elements we need. The colors seem a little bit off. They don't really match each other. So now we can do a little bit of color correction, make the elements match, kind of fix the colors. I'm also going to add a little bit of depth of field using that depth pass. And another thing I'm going to do with the depth pass is add some haze to the air, because everything looks a little bit too sharp and clean and perfect and just CG. So if we add a little bit of depth haze, it's going to make it feel a little bit closer to what you would capture in camera. So let's actually do that first. I'm going to go to Layer, New, and add a new solid. And I'm going to try to pick sort of the color of the sky, maybe a little bit lighter. If you don't quite get the right color, that's okay. We'll adjust it. Something like that. Okay. Now I'm going to add the gradient wipe to our new layer. And we're going to change our gradient layer to the depth pass. I'm going to increase the transition completion. And once again, it's wiping the wrong direction. I want it to be more blue the farther back it goes. So let's invert the gradient. And I'm also going to increase the transition softness. And it's way too much, so we can turn down the opacity of the entire thing. Now, depending on how hazy you want your scene to look, you can increase or decrease the transition completion. So you could create a foggy scene if you wanted to. I'm not sure I like this color, so you can add a hue and saturation effect, and maybe we'll actually try a dusty color to match the sand. It's really up to you the look you want to get. Next, I'm going to add a little bit of depth of field, and that's an expensive effect, so I'm going to put it on an adjustment layer so that we can turn it off until we're ready to render. So let's go up to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to add a camera lens blur. Let's change the blur layer to the depth pass, and I'm going to really crank up the blur radius so we can see the effect that's happening. So you can see it's actually blurring out some of the image, but not all of it. If you go to the blur focal distance and increase that, then that should bring our character into focus. So let's try to keep him in focus. I'm going to keep the blur radius turned way up just so it's easy to adjust and get the focus right where I want it, and then later I'll turn it down. Now the camera is moving and he moves away from the camera, so we need to keyframe the focal distance as we go. So let's start here on the first frame and try to get him as in focus as possible. Add a keyframe. We can see he moves a little bit closer to the camera, so maybe I'll turn that up so he's in focus. And then the camera starts to pull back away from him like this. So right before he launches in the air, let's add a new keyframe and try to get him back in focus. And when he's at the apex of his jump here, he's even more out of focus. So we're just going to keep turning this down to try to get him back in focus the whole time. Okay, bring it back right about there. about 90, and we'll just keep the car in focus for the rest of the shot. Perfect. So now I'm going to turn the blur radius back down because I don't want the background to be that out of focus. Let's go back down to about 5 or 10. I think for me, 5 looks pretty good. And that's the point where if the sky is a little bit pixelated because you use the free version, the effect will sort of blur it and integrate it into the background a little bit better. And it looks a lot better, but again, it's a very slow and expensive effect, so we can turn off the adjustment layer until we're ready to render at the end. Speaking of adjustments, let's fix the color of the sky. It doesn't quite look right. So I'm going to grab a curves effect and drop it onto our sky layer at the very bottom. And I think it's too dark. Let's increase that brightness. And if you want to make it look more blue, we can also increase the hue and saturation. And that looks a little bit more natural. While we have the adjustment layer at the top of the composition, we can actually turn that back on and use a curves effect to adjust the entire image. And we can add a color grade if we want something a little more creative or exciting. So maybe I want to add some contrast like this. This isn't really a color correction lesson, but feel free to do whatever you want to do to make the image look how you want it to look. So for example, we can go add a hue and saturation and switch to our yellows, and maybe just increase the saturation of the sand to give it sort of a fantastical stylized look. Last thing I want to do for color is I want to adjust our dust elements so they all match each other. So the big explosion doesn't quite match the color of our sand, so I'm going to add a curves layer to that, and also a hue and saturation. Let's turn that down a little bit to match the color of the sand, and then we can adjust the brightness of it, maybe bring those shadows up just a little bit. Beautiful. All right, 2 more things I want to add. I want to add some camera shake right when the shockwave hits him and the camera to give it a little bit more sense of weight and impact. And then at the end, I'm going to add some motion blur. Now I'll show you how to add camera shake for free using a wiggle expression, but if you're a pro user, you can use Crate's camera shake plugin to add jolts and handheld camera movements to your footage. It has a lot more control and it comes loaded with movement presets as well as slider controls for the speed and the intensity of the shake. To add the camera shake, we're going to select all of our layers and we will right click and go pre-compose, press OK. We'll just scrub through to make sure everything looks like it's still working right. Yep, looks good. Now to add camera shake, I'm going to go to the scale attribute and increase it just a little bit to try to ensure that when the camera starts shaking, the edges of the image don't appear. And then we'll go to the position attribute and we're going to add a quick expression. Let's all click on the stopwatch for the position and we'll type wiggle parentheses 380. And what that means is it's going to wiggle 80 pixels 3 times per second. So if you scrub through the timeline, you can get a sense for what it's doing. If you want it to move less, you can do 50 pixels. And if you want it to move faster, you can say maybe 6 times per second. It's really up to you, the feeling you want to go for. Now it's only going to be shaking for a split second, so you can go pretty extreme here, but you can always adjust it later if it's not quite right. So I'm going to start with 6 by 80. Now we have a problem. When we press play, we can see it's just wiggling the entire time, which we don't want. So I'm going to search for an effect called slider control and add that to the layer. And then I want to highlight 80 because that's the amount of pixels that it's moving. So I've highlighted the 80 and we're going to grab the pick whip and drag and drop it onto slider control. So now the slider controls how many pixels it's moving. If I set the slider to 0, then the effect is turned off. And if I set the slider to 80, it turns the effect back on. So let's start at 0. And right when the shockwave hits him and the camera like this, I want to add a keyframe for 0 on the slider. And as he goes up into the air a few frames later, I'll set it to 80. And then a few frames after that, we'll set it back down to 0. And you can see how that feels like a pretty strong little impact. So now we actually have to deal with where the edge of the image is appearing. I'm going to add an effect called motion tile. We're going to turn on mirror edges, and I'm going to increase the output height and the output width. And what that does is ensures that the border of the image will at least look like it's the right color. You can see we do get some weird artifacts. It kind of looks like it's tiling in a weird way, but hopefully with how quick it is on screen and how much it's moving, no one will notice this weird artifact of the image tiling. Now, if you really don't like that, you could just increase the scale to ensure that it never goes off the canvas, but eventually you're going to stretch the image so much that you're going to see some pixelization. So try this first and see if it works for you. There's one last thing we can do to make this look as good as possible, and that's adding motion blur. Let's grab our pre-comp here, and I'm going to pre-comp it again. We're going to move all the attributes to the new composition, and we're going to add an effect called pixel motion blur. What this does is it actually smears the image into a pretty good approximation of motion blur. But notice that by default it has low samples, meaning you can see individual copies of the image. So to fix that, we're going to increase our shutter samples to at least 16. Now this is going to run really slowly, so if you're still working on this, turn off the effect until you're ready to render because it really takes a long time to preview. But you can see now we've got some really nice motion blur, and it feels like vector motion blur. So each piece of the image that's moving in all different directions will blur in the proper direction. And in fact, when the camera shakes for the shockwave, the entire frame will blur to kind of increase the impact. Yeah, and just look how nice this looks when he's slamming into the car. It really makes it look painful. All right, and that's it. So that's how I composited that 3D shot for the previous video. And the reason why it works so well is because I rendered this 3D sequence with a depth pass straight out of Maya. Now, as I mentioned before, we are creating a plugin which creates a depth pass for footage that already exists. So maybe you've got some 3D footage that you rendered a long time ago and you didn't include a depth pass, or maybe you shot some footage with a camera and you want to add a depth pass to your live action footage. Our new plugin will be able to do that for you. And that will allow you to integrate our 2D effects into the 3D depth of the scene. So if you want to be notified right when that's ready, subscribe to the channel. Now, I'm normally a 3D artist. I don't usually use After Effects, so if you know of any way to improve this workflow that I showed you today, definitely leave a comment because I always want to learn and expand my skills. And if you composite your own scene using these files, be sure to tag us on Instagram with it or post it up on the Discord so everyone can see it. All right, later creators.